guys. Good morning. Once again, I'm having some difficulties. If you can't hear me, but you see my mouth moving, please let me know. I'm having some technical difficulties this morning already, and I haven't even started. Welcome to Turfgrass Epistemology. My name is TravisShaddox. Thank you all for coming this morning. If you're here, you're interested in turfgrass science, and we are here to find out how we know what we know about turfgrass science. I see some meters moving, so I'm going to assume that the audio is working, but I'm not going to swear to it. So if anybody has any IT experience or audio experience, please let me know, because for some reason my microphone does not like me. Okay, thank you all for letting me know. It sounds good. Okay. I see a lot of people already here this morning. Randy and Mitch and Connecticut Cubonic and Super TA. Transition Zone Guy 7B. I'm sorry if I don't remember you, but welcome. If you've been here before, I apologize. It's hard for me to keep track of everything. It's the first time I remember seeing that name. Yeah, it sounds like everybody got a little bit of a cold snap last night. I woke up this morning, it was about 30 here, 31. There's some ice outside. I didn't know it, and I quickly learned that was not water, that was ice on the ground. So it got cold last night. A storm front came through and rained all night last night here in Lexington. And this morning it's freezing. But the rest of the week is going to be super nice. It's supposed to be sunny here. I guess this weather is headed up towards New England at the moment. So sorry if you guys are going to get hit up there, but it looks like it's coming your way, just past us. It's February 13th, 2024. I'm going to be off on Wednesday night for Valentine's. I totally forgot that that's Valentine's Day night. Valentine's Day night. Yeah, that's right. And so I won't be here on Wednesday night, but there's a pretty good chance that I'll have an additional show this week, either on Thursday or Friday. And if I do, it will be because I'm trying to get an author on, and he said he might be available either Thursday or on Friday, and I have no idea what time. So you'll see it posted on the live chat or the live stream, upcoming live stream, if I end up doing that on Thursday or Friday. Pretty good chance I'll do it. It's all depending on his schedule. So look forward to that. If I get him on, it'll be exciting. Where he has a nitrification volatilization paper that we're going to go over. Other thing is, I'm going to try to keep this to an hour. It seems like after about an hour, my voice starts to go. It's difficult for me to speak. My voice starts to kind of break, and I can't speak very well without it irritating my throat. So I'm going to try to speed things up a little bit more and get out of here in an hour, so I don't have such difficulty speaking. So you might have noticed that. I tend to have challenges speaking after about an hour my throat goes. We have an article today. For the last week or two, we've been talking about nitrogen. And this whole week, we're talking about nitrogen, stabilized nitrogen, which is essentially urea or ammonium sulfate. But nowadays in our industry, it's primarily urea. That has an additive, usually two additives. One additive is intended to reduce the volatilization of urea, and then the other additive is included to reduce the conversion of ammonium into nitrate. So we're going over those two compounds all week this week, today and tomorrow, and then maybe again on Thursday or Friday. The take-home message is basically these products work in ag quite well, and what I mean by work is they end up increasing yield, so the farmer makes more money from yield than they spent on the additive. But in turfgrass, we generally don't see that. The benefits are few and far between, and when there is a benefit, it doesn't account for the additional cost of the product. in turfgrass science. So most of the literature, I think most of the scientists, well, I don't know, I have to ask them, but I think most of the literature, and it's my opinion, that the lack of effectiveness of these products in turfgrass science is due to a couple things. But it's primarily the soil turfgrass system is fundamentally different than an agricultural system where we have, in turfgrass, we have a lot of roots. We generally can control the water better. Because of that, we can move the urea into the soil. The turfgrass has a much greater capability of taking it up than row crops generally. And in row crops, we have less control over water, and because of that, oftentimes we can have gaseous loss of nitrogen. But in turfgrass, we just generally don't have those conditions. And therefore, we don't generally have, there's a need for these products in our management practices. It would be different if the nitrification or the stabilized nitrogen sources were 5 or 10% more than urea. I wouldn't really be sitting here having a conversation probably, because there's like, it's 5 or 10% more. Even if I get 5 or 10% more increase, then it's probably worth it. But they're not 5 or 10% more money compared to urea. They're oftentimes twice as expensive as urea. And because of that gap in cost, we just don't see the concomitant increase in some other desirable metric. There's also oftentimes I've ran into people who have this understanding that the nitrification inhibitors and the urease inhibitors prolong the solubility or uptake potential of the urea. In other words, it turns a urea into somewhat of a slow release type of a product. And the evidence doesn't support that either. And this paper here will show that as well. It's still urea. It's still soluble. It doesn't necessarily result in a prolonged result or prolonged response just because you're slowing down your urease and you're slowing down denitrification or nitrification. That doesn't in turn result in extended longevity of the urea. We don't see that in turfgrass anyway. So we're going to talk about that today in this paper. Before I move on to it, there was a couple of things that happened yesterday. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page you all understand why I'm here. I'm here doing this content for only one reason, and that is to have a beneficial impact on the turfgrass industry. That's it. This actually costs me money to run. Okay, there's no money made on this channel. I'm not selling anything. I don't sell fertilizer. I have some services I provide if you're so inclined to take advantage of those. But I'm here to help. And that's it. I mean, there's no other reason. And I try to do that by presenting the evidence in scientific literature. But please understand, I've said this before, it's not TravisShaddox saying this stuff. Okay? I'm simply communicating the evidence that has been published in the scientific literature. So when you leave and you receive this information, use it as best you can and, assimilate it and, turn it into use. That's what we want. That's what we do this research for. But please keep in mind that it's not me saying it. Okay. So the manner in which I communicate it is another issue. If you've been focusing on the manner in which I speak, the foibles in my character, my mannerisms and so forth, that's another issue completely. Focus on the content. Okay. And it's the content that I'm trying to get across. The way in which I get it across, if you're going to judge that and you're going to criticize that, that's what I am. I mean, I'm on YouTube. You can criticize me all you want. I'm putting myself out there. But I'm not really interested in that. I'm not really going to engage with you if you're going to judge and criticize me as a human, as a person. If you want to judge and criticize the scientific literature, come on. Let's talk about it. That's what I do. That's what I'm interested in. So, the content is what I'm trying to get across. And that's what I am strongly in favor of critiquing. But as I've said many times, I'm not in favor of judging or criticizing other humans or their behaviors or their color, or their skin, or their religion, or their politics, or all of that. To me is irrelevant to turfgrass science. It has no impact on turfgrass science at all. So say what you want about, humans, but if you're going to criticize and judge other humans, don't expect me to engage with you on that regard. Okay? I'm here to help people by communicating evidence in the scientific literature. And if you disagree with the scientific literature, publish your paper. Where's your paper? Publish your paper and bring it on and we'll talk about it. But that's what I'm here for is the science. And I hope that this feels to you all like it's a safe place to kind of just come and learn science. I'm not talking about politics. I don't talk about religion. I'm not going to talk about someone's place where they were born, or they're autistic, or they're ADHD, or they're heterosexual or homosexual or whatever. I couldn't care less about any of that in terms of how it affects turfgrass science. I care about you as a human regardless of all that. Whatever you may or may not be, or however you recognize yourself is important to me as you are a human. But I'm here to talk about turfgrass science, and that's what I hope that we stick to. And that's that. Okay. So today, the article we're going to talk about is a really good article. I like the article, and I like the manner in which they show it. It's a little bit like yesterday's article. And I'm going to show some of the results in a PowerPoint that's just a little easier to understand, I guess. But again, we're talking about DCD, which is dycandiamide, for those people who may be new to that product or turfgrass science. The title of it is Evaluation of Dycandiamide Amended Fertilizers on Kentucky Bluegrass. It was published by Mosdell, Daniel, and Freeborg. I believe these guys were in Indiana. So they were at Purdue. This was published in Agronomy Journal in 1986. So for those of you who may be new to the channel, most of these articles I go over are published in one of the Tri-Society journals: Agronomy Journal, Soil Science Society of America Journal, Crop Science, or Journal of Environmental Quality. I also go over Hort Science and the ASHS, the American Society of Horticultural Sciences, as well. So if you ever want to look up stuff, or you ever want to just peruse the scientific literature, you can go to crops.org, agronomy.org, soils.org, ashs.org. The Weed Science Society of America, they have really good journals that they publish in as well. And just search their literature. You can at least come up with the abstract. And if all you do is pull this up and read the abstract, you can see this portion right here where it says abstract. And you can read, it's pretty clear in the abstract that, hang on, let me get to it. I mean, let's just read a couple sentences in the abstract. This would, if you're not a member, or you don't want to go to the library and download this article, or go to your university and download the article, you can read the abstract and get some basic information. And in the abstract, it says clipping yields in response to DCD amended fertilizers were similar to that of urea. So, you can see the clipping yield is not going to change. See if they say the quality, because here it is. Turf quality of plots receiving IBD. Oh, IBD was superior to all other in sources. I was looking for DCD. I don't see the. It's in here somewhere. I'm just missing it. We'll talk about the quality. Fall applied DCD did not influence soil ammonium or nitrate concentrations at the top 20 centimeters, and so. Oh, here it is at the end. So the last sentence in the abstract should tell you right here what at least give you some confidence on whether or not you should consider using it. It says the last sentence of the abstract says the short period of effectiveness of DCD would seldom warrant its use as a nitrification inhibitor in turf. Sometimes, there's some really good authors today. I don't know if I put myself in that category, but there's some really good authors today that would say stuff like that. They just say this is what it is. But oftentimes we don't see that quite worded so tersely. I just like reading these old articles because back then in 86, there was less of an impact there was less bias in the literature from funding agencies and sponsors because a lot of the research was funded by the state. So they just said, hey, it wouldn't warrant its use. Don't use it. Nowadays, it would be worded a lot more soft than that, I think. But anyway, you can just read that for free, the abstract for free, and get an idea what we're going to find. So please consider that if you're looking into gaining more knowledge on turfgrass science, you can go look this stuff for free and get a basic general idea, even if you don't want to download the entire article. We're going to skip through this a fair amount here, but the basic introduction is this: with the increasing costs of nitrogen fertilizers and the potential for nitrate pollution of lakes and groundwater, efficiency in nitrogen management is extremely important. That's the same today. I mean, we still have to be very efficient in how we manage nitrogen. Application of slow-release nitrogen you're going to see this a lot. You're going to see this word tend quite a bit in this article. That's the one thing I would say about this article is problematic, is that we don't use the word tend in scientific literature nowadays. And back in the day, I guess it was more acceptable. But you're going to see in here treatment tended to increase quality, but there was no difference. So the word tend is a way to smuggle in significance when there's no significance. So I can say the earth tends to look flat when I'm looking at the ocean. It tends to look flat, but it's not. So that it's a way to, like I said, to sneak in significance when there is none. So whenever you see the word tend, you just don't. You want to look at the data and actually see what's biologically significant or statistically significant. But as a reviewer and as a editor of these, or past reviewer and past editor of these journals, that's always a little bit concerning to me when I see these words, because we want to be careful about how we word things so that the reader can walk away with some confidence that this is actually what happened, or this isn't not what happened, or whatever. Anyway. Applications of slow-release nitrogen tend to minimize leaching losses by reducing concentrations of nitrate in the soil solution. And then he goes into some literature about how that happens. The benefits of late-season nitrogen applications to cool-season grasses are well documented. There's a whole playlist on late fall applications, particularly in cool-season grasses, on my channel. Just go to the playlist. I think it's called late fall fertility, or something like that, late-season fall fertility. And we talked for a month. I think there's 10 or 12 articles or more in there about late season fall fertility. And he has some of these two articles, the Schmidt I didn't go over the Schmidt and Blazer paper, I don't think, on my channel, but the Powell 67 paper I went over. However, the potential for nitrate losses is greatest from fall to early spring, when rainfall exceeds evaporation and temperatures reduce plant uptake of nitrogen. So this sentence, although I didn't highlight it, is important. I'm going to bring it on the screen here. However, the potential for nitrate losses is greatest from fall to early spring. So basically all winter, when the rainfall exceeds, and this is in Indiana, rainfall exceeds evapotranspiration and temperatures reduce plant uptake. So in the winter, even in cool season grasses, there is a reduction of plant growth and reduction of plant uptake. But there's oftentimes still water. It just rained probably a quarter inch last night here in Kentucky, and my grass isn't growing at all. And it's been raining all January. Basically, the entire month of January it rained here in Lexington. And the grass isn't growing. So this is where the increased risk comes from, these late season applications in late fall or early winter, where they'll say, well, go ahead and put it down and it'll be here next spring. There's plenty of evidence that I went over on the channel in the playlist that clearly concludes that's unnecessary. It increases the risk of off-site movement. You can just go out in the spring and put out some nitrogen then and avoid all that winter risk. Put it out a little bit before or right at greening in the spring when the grass begins to grow, and you'll be fine. This concept of putting out organics and this slow release stuff, we need to move past that in the winter. There's no need. And there's not really any good reason to apply really any source of nitrogen at a time or in a location, i.e. surface or subsurface or whatever, at a time or a location where the turf grass can't take it up. Okay. the only benefit goes to the salesman, really. The benefit's not to the turf. The turf can't take it up. There's increased risk because it can move off site. And you can simply avoid that and apply it in the spring and probably have as good or better responses by doing it then rather than doing it in the late fall or early winter. And that's what he says here in this article right here. So it's clear. And this was from 1986. And even today, I think even today, it's probably even getting worse, where people are still putting out these organics and these slow release materials in December and January. I will put it out and it'll still be here. And, we can keep ignoring the evidence if you want to, but eventually the government's going to come around and shut this stuff down, and we're going to complain that there's too many regulations. Okay, I've seen it happen many, many times, and, it's inevitable if we just continue to ignore the evidence. Since leaching and denitrification are the primary means of nitrate loss, for those who don't know, denitrification is the gaseous loss of nitrogen from the nitrate form to the nitrite form. It goes up into to the atmosphere. And leaching, of course, and we all know what that is movement below the rooting zone, but denitrification is the loss. So nitrate can be lost in two forms, either movement downward or even laterally away from the plant, or through gaseous loss as well. Those are the primary means of nitrate loss. Efficiency in nitrogen management may be improved with nitrification inhibitors. Dycandiamide, and I'm going to refer to it as DCD for the rest of the paper, obtained from this company, is an organic nitrogen compound which inhibits the cytochrome oxidase involved in ammonium oxidation by Nitrosomonas bacteria. So that's a long-winded way and a sort of a scientific way of saying there's a bacteria that's required to convert ammonium to nitrate, and it blocks that function. It stops the conversion at that point in the nitrogen cycle. So the urea that converts over to ammonium, in the presence of DCD, the intent is to keep it in the ammonium form so that you reduce the gaseous loss of nitrogen through denitrification, and you reduce the nitrate leaching by keeping it in a cationic form of ammonium rather than an anionic form of nitrate. Okay. For those people who aren't familiar with soil science, nitrates will generally leach much more readily because they're negatively charged than ammonium, which is positively charged. And our soils will generally hold on to positively charged elements or ions. Okay. So that's the reason why there's some value, at least in agriculture, to keeping it in ammonium form. They're trying to prevent it to be convert to nitrate because we have much more likelihood of it being lost in the nitrate form than ammonium. And all that's pretty true. In the literature, you'll see that. In the literature, you'll see quite a bit of evidence that does happen. Not so much in this paper. We're going to see. But I will agree with that. And I think the literature is fairly clear on that. But again, like I've said before, I don't particularly care about that per se. I care if that occurs and in turn there's a benefit to the turfgrass, then I care. Right? In other words, increased color, increased quality, increased growth, whatever metric you want to look at. Because if it maintains the ammonium form and it prevents leaching and prevents denitrification, that's all fine if you want to look at it from an environmental perspective. That's good. But if it maintains an ammonium form and there's no benefit to the turf, then you're not going to see that, and you're not going to see a return on your investment in that product. So that's what I care about primarily. There's an environmental component as well that I'm interested in as well. But for turfgrass managers, we're interested in creating a product and with the minimum impact of the environment and minimum cost. Most nitrification inhibitors are too volatile to broadcast applications to turfgrass. DCD is a non-volatile inhibitor that can be incorporated into urea and ammonium sulfate granules. This study was initiated to evaluate a urea, ammonium sulfate, and a complete fertilizer, all amended with DCD at different application rates and timing for use in the nitrogen fertilization program of Wabash, Kentucky bluegrass. Comparisons were made with standard turf fertilizers, both soluble and slow-release nitrogen sources, to observe any benefit of the DCD. So I'm not going to show every possible nitrogen source they use in here. I'm going to focus primarily on urea and ammonium sulfate and the control. But you're more than welcome to go in here and read the whole thing and get all the information you want about all the additional comparisons they made. Okay, this research was conducted at the Purdue Agronomy Farm near West Lafayette, Indiana. The test site was a 1-year-old Wabash, Kentucky bluegrass. Maintenance fertilization had been kept to a minimum prior to this experiment, and plots were irrigated when signs of wilt appeared. And you're going to see that the fertility being kept at a minimum is obvious in the study as evidenced by the control. The quality of the controlled turfgrass was below acceptable limits, meaning they picked the right location to put this. If the turfgrass is already acceptable, you can pull some results out of that. You can pull some conclusions out of that. But if the turf's acceptable all the time with no nitrogen, it's not quite as meaningful or impactful to me as if you started off with a turfgrass that's not acceptable, obviously. The treatments consisted of urea, ammonium sulfate, and a complete fertilizer, which was a 32-2-4 in 1981 and 1982, and a 22-4-10 in 1983. We're not going to talk about the complete fertilizer a whole lot, so it's sort of irrelevant, but I wanted to mention that there is a complete fertilizer in here if you're looking for that. All of them were amended with DCD, so that 10% of the nitrogen was derived from DCD. Also, ammonium sulfate with 15% of the nitrogen from DCD was included in 1981 and 1982, but our initial results indicated no benefit of additional DCD. So what he's saying is no benefit. He's not saying no benefit of DCD. He's saying no benefit of the additional DCD. So there was no need to put in 15%. They just put in 10. So ammonium sulfate with 10% of the nitrogen from DCD was substituted in 1983 and 1984. The study was initiated on July 10th of 1981. Treatments were reapplied on the 1st of September, and then in 1981. And then application dates for 1982, 83, and 84 were as follows. So I'm going to read the application dates for those listening. The first application in 1982, all the applications of the first of the year were made basically at the end of May. So 1982, 83, and 84, it was at the end of May. 1982, 83, and 84, the second application was essentially at the beginning of July. And then the third application was towards the end of August or the 1st of September. And the last application was the 82 was the middle of October, but 83 and 84 was the middle of November. So they're doing 4 applications of 1 pound. They also have information here about 2 applications of 2 pounds, and I'll talk about that coming up. Treatments were applied, here it is. Treatments were applied at a rate of 1 pound of nitrogen split into 4 equal applications, or 2 pounds of nitrogen in 2 equal applications for a yearly rate of 4 pounds of nitrogen per year. The 2 applications of 2 pounds of nitrogen was applied at the 1st and 4th date. So it was applied at the end of May, and it was applied towards the middle to the end of August when they applied 2 pounds of nitrogen. Okay. Okay, so the clipping yields. Clipping yields consisted of, what is that point? Okay, it's a little bit messed up here in the PDF. I can't read that. But I'm going to say it consisted of a 40 centimeter swath cut with a reel mower at 50 millimeters height across the length of the plot when the grass was approximately 75 millimeters tall. Okay, so it was cut at 50 millimeters once it got up to 75 millimeters. So they're staying within the 2/3 rule, even in 1986, really. Visual quality ratings were taken approximately every 2 weeks during the growing season. Quality was based on a scale from 1 to 10, with 10 being optimal, 1 being very poor, and a rating of 6.1 was selected as a minimum standard for acceptable turf. Nowadays, this rating scale, I mean, you can rate it however you want, but generally, turf scientists have, non-verbally agreed that a 1 to 9 scale with 6 minimum acceptable is generally what we'll use. That doesn't have to be that way, but generally that's the case. And back then it was 1 to 10 this person used, and he used 6.1. So 6 was not acceptable, but anything greater than 6, I guess, would be how I would read that. In the spring and fall, 5 25 millimeter plugs. I'm reading this because there's a little bit of confusion in one of the tables, and I want to make sure we're clear on what happened here. Actually, I'm not clear on what happened. I'm going to read it, and maybe you guys can figure out if it's clear or not. In the spring and fall, 5 25 millimeter diameter plugs were taken into a depth of 40 centimeters. So that would be like, what is 40 centimeters? Probably 10 inches. Guess I can do the math. 8 inches. Guess it's 8 inches. Oh, 15 inches. Well, that can't be right. Is it 8 centimeters? Did I say 8? What did I say? 80 centimeters? Lost my place. Depth of 25, depth of 0.4 meters. So, okay, 40. Must have misspoke there. Yeah, 50. That doesn't look right. Yeah, no, it is 0.4 meters. That's deep. That's 15 inches. Oh, and then, okay, and then the sample, okay, so they went down 15 inches, and then the sample was divided to the top 7 inches and the bottom 7 inches, essentially, is what they did. And that's awful deep, but that's fine. In the fall of 1984, the top 7 inches, the top 7-inch sections were divided into 0. This is really confusing. 0 to 80 and 80 to 200 millimeter samples. I don't think they could get more confusing. So they split it up in the top 3 inches. So basically in 1984, they went down 15 inches and then they cut that in half. So they looked at the top half and they looked at the bottom half. And then in 1984, they just looked at the top 3 inches and then the remaining 12 inches, I guess, is what they did in 1984. I'm not sure why they did that. What probably happened, I don't know if I can read their mind or not, but what probably happened is they probably didn't see anything happen the first 2 years in the top 7 inches. And so they just decided to look at what's happening up closer to the surface of the soil, or surface of the turf grass, to see if they'd see any differences there. I don't know if that's what they did or not, but I don't know if that's why they did it, but regardless. Okay, so that's all the materials and methods. So let's set the stage. They're applying urea, ammonium sulfate, and a complete fertilizer with DCD and without DCD on Kentucky bluegrass in Indiana in 1981, 82, 83, and 84. Okay, they're going to look at turf grass quality. They have some clipping yield information in here as well. And then they also did some soil sampling to see the amount of ammonium and the amount of nitrate that existed in the soil at different depths. So the idea is that with the application of DCD, you should, in theory, have greater quantities of ammonium in the soil and less quantities of nitrate in the soil, because the DCD is intended to hold the nitrogen in the ammonium form and reduce the amount of nitrogen in the nitrate form. Okay, that's what you should see. And if you are, enhancing the efficiency or maintaining a greater quantity of nitrogen in the soil, you should, in turn, see a response in the turf grass, more color or more growth, something along those lines. Because the concept is, well, we're losing less of the nitrogen to gas, therefore more of the nitrogen is remaining in the soil, and therefore the turf grass should respond favorably in those cases. That's what you should see. That's what the idea behind this was. Okay, let's look and see what happened here. I'm going to show most of the results in the figures and tables, but I'll read a little bit at the beginning. Turf grass response to applications of urea, ammonium sulfate, and DCD amended fertilizers were similar throughout this study, except for one date when it applied 2 pounds of nitrogen at two applications in 1983. So, I mean, really, you don't even really need to read anymore. I mean, we're going to, but it just says right there, turf yield response to the applications of urea, ammonium sulfate, were the same as when you applied urea and ammonium sulfate with DCD. So whether you invested the money to put in this, stabilized compound into the urea and ammonium sulfate, you're adding cost, you're adding a product to stabilize the nitrogen, to keep more of it available to the plant, quote unquote, available to the plant. And it says turf yield response was the same whether you had it in there or whether you didn't. So, I mean, what a great way to start the results. A great sentence like that. I love it. I will read this next sentence because I don't know if I'm going to show the graphs or not, but let me just read this because it's a little bit, sometimes they did this in the past where if two treatments were similar or there was no differences between them, they wouldn't show one, they would just show the other. And because a lot of times they did all these comparisons and they did 15 treatments and you put all on one line graph, it all gets confusing. You can't see anything. And so generally in the past, they would just eliminate one if they were the same. Nowadays, I don't think we would really do that, but let me read this. It says, consequently, yields of ammonium sulfate and the complete fertilizer plus DCD treatments of 4 1-pound applications and ammonium sulfate of 2 2-pound applications were not presented in the graph, meaning there was no differences, so they didn't show those treatments. Okay, is what it is. So that was the yield. I'll show the yield in this table here. Be happy to, but essentially there was no difference. So what I've done here in this table is table 1, the summary of treatment mean comparisons of clippings by weight. Now, if you were here yesterday, you saw some statistics that were a little bit peculiar. They were a little bit different than what you would see today, where today you might see least significant differences, or you might see A's and B's and C's, and whichever ones have the same letter are the same, and which are, so forth. You might see that in today. Before the last, really around the turn of the century, they started moving more towards that, A's and B's and Glimixes and GLM models and all these other things. Duncans and Dunnett's and all these other things where they're more the multiple comparison tests, post-hoc multiple comparison tests. But before that, there was a lot more usage of these single degree contrasts where you can only make so many comparisons based upon the degrees of freedom that you have. And that was yesterday's paper, where you have like ammonium sulfate compared to ammonium sulfate with DCD. They're just making that comparison. And they're not comparing ammonium sulfate to every other treatment. Okay, and that's what you're going to see in this study as well. Okay, so in this study on table 1, you're going to see urea versus urea with DCD. And I kind of like this because it's very straightforward. Okay, and you're going to see 1982, 1983, and 1984. And you're going to see 2 columns. One column is 1 is greater than 2, meaning the treatment in column 1, which in this case is urea, is greater or was greater than the Turfgrass response to the treatment in column 2, which in this case was urea plus DCD. And they're going to have dates. So of all the rating dates that they took, when it met that criteria, when it was greater than one treatment was greater than the other, and then they included the date in which that occurred. And the number of times where urea was greater, the Turfgrass response to urea was greater than the Turfgrass response to urea plus DCD was 0 in 1982. Okay? There was one date where the Turfgrass response to urea plus DCD was greater than urea, and that was on May 3rd in 1982. So that one date, there was a difference. All other rating dates in 1982, there were no differences between the two. Okay, and they took they took clipping weights, I think every other rating date. I can't remember. I have to go back and look, but there was multiple clippings. Actually, we can look it up here, I think. Let's see. Let me see how frequently they did clippings. I don't know if they should say it in here, but maybe they didn't. I don't see how frequently they did the clippings. Clippings is in this paragraph here, but I don't see how frequently they did it. It's probably in here. I'm just missing it. Oh, it just says, that says whenever it got to 75 millimeters, they cut it back down to 50, but they don't say the number of times they did it. Regardless, there's multiple collections in 1982, because you can see below there was at least 3, because there's 3 times where they differed. Anyway, okay. In 1983, there were no differences between urea and urea plus DCD. Urea plus DCD was never greater, and urea was never greater than urea plus DCD. So in the entire year of 1983, there was no benefit to applying a product that is of greater expense, being DCD. In 1984 is the same thing. There was no differences in, did I say quality? I meant clipping weights. There was no differences in clipping weights in 1983 or 1984 when we added DCD to urea. So now when we add DCD to ammonium sulfate in 1982, 1983, and 1984, there was never a time where the inclusion of DCD resulted in a difference in clipping weight compared to just urea alone. So I'm sorry, ammonium sulfate alone. Okay, so between ammonium sulfate and urea, there was only one date in the first year where your DCD resulted in greater growth. Every other date for every other year, they were the same for clipping weights. When you look at sulfur-coated urea versus the urea, ammonium sulfate, and the complete, basically with just sulfur-coated alone, compared to all the other nitrogen sources with DCD, we see 3 dates where the sulfur coat resulted in greater clipping weights than the nitrogen sources with DCD in 1982. And then we see 2 where the nitrogen sources with DCD were greater than sulfur coat. And then the remainder of 83 and 84, there was one time where the clipping weight was greater from SCU. There was a couple of times when clipping weights were greater using DCD nitrogen sources. It just went back and forth. In other words, it was basically a wash. There was some times when urea resulted in greater growth. SCU resulted in greater growth. And there were some times when DCD compounds resulted in greater growth. And the other times there was no difference. Okay. This was all when the nitrogen was applied at 2 pounds 2 times. When the nitrogen was applied at 1 pound 4 times, there was only one difference among any of these. Okay. And it was when in 1982, urea plus DCD resulted in greater growth than straight urea once on June 3rd. Every other time, there was no additional growth resulting from the inclusion of DCD to urea, to ammonium sulfate, to the complete fertilizer. There was no measured increase in clipping weights. So if you want to increase the growth rate of your grass, there was really not much strong evidence at all that you can rely. There is no strong evidence in this paper that you can rely upon DCD to provide that result, because sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work, sometimes not including it actually was better for clipping weights. Okay, but let's go to turf quality. As you all probably know, the turf quality is where I put a lot of my confidence. And here's another tended to. Turf quality tended to be higher for the DCD amended fertilizers than that of urea and ammonium sulfate. And I really wish, I hope nowadays the editors take this stuff out, because if you just read that sentence, you go, oh, well, I should include it. But then the very next sentence says, not even, it's a comma, and then it's the same sentence says, although comparisons were not significant. Well, if they're not significant, then what are you going to do? So let's look at to see if they're actually biologically significant. So here's the quality in table 2. I've turned these into graphs. So we're going to look at all these data in graph format to make it a little bit more visual and easier for you all, I hope, to pick up differences. So in graph format, we'll see the influence of DCD on Kentucky bluegrass quality. Was that 2 pounds? Okay, so the 2 pounds applied twice. And we see that in 1982, there was no benefit to applying DCD in terms of quality. There was no benefit here. This is not significant. And then, oh wait, did I have, oh, hang on a second. Let me fix this. There's something missing here. Oh. There's something missing from the legend. Hang on a second. Let me fix this. There's something missing from the legend. I don't want to confuse anybody. Why is that? Yeah, okay, there we go. Yeah, the SCU was not showing up on that. Okay, now we see SCU. So we see the different, this blue and orange. So for those listening, I'm in 1982. The quality of the urea was above 6, which was the minimum acceptable limit, and the urea plus DCD was basically the same. In 1982, with ammonium sulfate, the quality was right at 6. It went up a little bit to 6.5 or something. There was no statistical difference, and biologically, I wouldn't argue that that's the same. I mean, different. I would say that's probably the same. And then the inclusion of sulfur coat was the same. So for all those talking about, these slow release nitrogen sources resulting in greater quality and longevity or whatever, I've mentioned before, generally there's not a lot there to support that. There is benefit to applying slow releases. I'm going to go into that. If have I already gone on the slow release? I don't know, but I'll go into. There's benefits, but increased color and increased longevity generally isn't supported. And here's some more evidence of that, because the quality from SCU was the same from the quality by urea, and the same for ammonium sulfate in 1982. And you'll see the same thing in 1983. There were no differences. These are all the same. And they're all right around 6.5. Nothing much greater than about 6.5, whether it was from urea or ammonium sulfate, or whether it was in DCD was included or not, or whether you use sulfur-coated urea. Their qualities were all basically the same. They said, what they said in the text was they tended to be. What he's talking about is this little increase here. These small little increases is where you can smuggle in significance when there is none. And I would say this is not, well, we know it's not statistically significant. And I would say biologically, that's not significant. You're not going to be able to see a difference between 6 and a 6.5 by the majority of people. It's very, maybe a well-trained scientist with a very keen eye for quality could pull that out, but 6 to 6.5 is cutting hairs. Okay. So I would say biologically and scientific or statistically, this is not significant. And then in 1984 is the same thing. The sulfur coat urea was the same as the urea, same as the ammonium sulfate. The inclusion of DCD didn't increase anything statistically or biologically in terms of the quality of Kentucky bluegrass when it was applied at 2 pounds at the beginning of the summer and then 2 pounds in the middle of the summer. Okay. Let's look and see what happens when the nitrogen was applied 4 times at 1 pound. So at 4 times at 1 pound, we also, this is the control in this case. I thought I had this fixed, but let me fix this again so nobody thinks I'm screwing something up. This is a control on this particular graph. It's not sulfur coat. So this is the control. And the reason I included that is to show that the location was suitable, because without applying nitrogen, the non-treated turfgrass was a 4, which you will know and your customers will know, and your superintendent and the members and the football players and soccer players, they're going to know if the turfgrass is a 4. It's not going to be acceptable. And in 1983, it was closer to a 3. In 1984, it was closer to a 4. So it floated in the 3s or 4s when you applied no nitrogen. And when you applied urea, of course, the quality goes up to about 6.5 in 1982 when you applied 4 1-pound apps. And the urea plus DCD, this is what they're talking about, 10 to 2, 6.5 to 7 when you applied DCD. This is statistically insignificant, and I would say biologically it's insignificant. You're not going to be able to see a 6.5 to a 7. Or 6.8 to a 7, whatever this gap is here, okay, between ammonium sulfate and ammonium sulfate plus DCD in 1982. 1983, essentially the same thing. The quality was generally lower across the board in 1983, down closer to 5.5, 5.8 from all treatments. And then in 1984, the treatment qualities, the turfgrass qualities went up to about 6, a little over 6, something like that, with no increase from the inclusion of DCD, okay. So here's the quality. And they said there's no statistical significance. And you can look at that table, and this is all the exact same data. Okay. So from that PDF or that PowerPoint, this is where I pulled all the PowerPoint data from this particular table. And there's not a lot there to support including. And you'll see that this one they use actually a least significant difference. And you'll see there's no significant differences among any of these quality ratings, except for from the control, there was a difference between applying nitrogen and not applying nitrogen. So let's look at the recovery in the nitrogen tissue. Oftentimes we get this argument sometimes, well, I'm going to apply this because it's enhanced efficiency, so it's going to increase nitrogen use efficiency. And again, occasionally you'll see something. Most of the time you don't. So in table 3, we see urea and urea plus DCD, ammonium sulfate and ammonium sulfate plus DCD, and then we have sulfur-coated urea. And we have the 4 1-pound apps and the 2 2-pound apps here on the same table. And when you see these values here, so I'm going to say urea and then urea plus DCD, it's the percent of nitrogen that was applied that was recovered in leaf tissue. And when you just applied urea with 4 1-pound apps, you got 37% of the nitrogen in the leaf tissue. And when you applied urea plus 10% DCD, you got 38. So, there's just not a lot there. Okay. And it says non-significant here. So urea plus DCD versus urea plus DCD, there's no difference between these two. When you look at ammonium sulfate, you see 32.6, let's just say 33, and well, let's say 32.6, and then 35.4 when the DCD was added. So you went from 32.6% of the nitrogen taken up to 35% of the nitrogen taken up. And it actually was statistically significant. Okay. Biologically, I'm like, that's not particularly of a wow factor to me. You're gaining a couple percentage points, if that's what you want. It didn't result in any increased quality, didn't result in any increased growth, but there's a little bit there from ammonium sulfate when you applied 4 1-pound apps for including DCD. So the question you ask yourself is, am I willing to pay double for the nitrogen to get 35% in the tissue compared to 32% in the tissue of what was applied when there's no increase in quality and there was no influence on yield? It's up to you to make that choice. When we look at when the nitrogen was applied as 2 pounds twice, then there were no differences at all. The inclusion of DCD had no influence on the nitrogen leaf tissue content, the leaf tissue content of nitrogen. There was no benefit or disadvantage to including DCD in with urea or ammonium sulfate. And you see the inclusion of sulfur coat was, there was no difference at all between that either. So sulfur coat resulted in equivalent leaf tissue nitrogen. Okay. Now let's look at the soil inorganic nitrogen. This is a little bit more complicated, but I'll sum it up by basically saying not a lot happened. Okay, really. The one thing that you should bank on, theoretically speaking, on DCD is that you're going to have greater ammonium in the soil compared to nitrate in the soil. That's the one thing at least in the agricultural literature, it's fairly consistent that's going to be, the conversion is going to be slowed. So you would expect greater quantities of ammonium than greater quantities of nitrate. And across the board, that's what the compound's supposed to do. But in turfgrass systems, we just don't see a lot there. Okay. So when we look at, and I'm looking at table 4 for those listening, and we're looking at the effect of nitrogen sources from 2 2-pound applications on ammonium and nitrate concentrations in the top 20 centimeters. Okay. So what was that? Top 20 centimeters is, I can't do those conversions in my head very quickly. Top 8 inches, basically. Okay. So top 8 inches, we look in 1982 and we see nothing, urea was applied. And when urea was applied with DCD, there were no differences between the quantities of ammonium and the quantities of nitrate. When you included DCD, it was the same. So what they're talking about is these two values here, 5.2 and 5.5 milligrams per kilogram parts per million of ammonium. When urea was applied, it was 5.2. When urea plus DCD was applied, it was 5.5, and those weren't different. And then with nitrate, 4.3 milligrams or parts per million when urea was applied, and 5.7 when DCD was applied with it. No significant difference. When the DCD was applied with ammonium sulfate, there was an increase in ammonium in 1982 from 3 parts per million to 5. So not quite doubling the ammonium in 1982 from ammonium sulfate. There was no difference in nitrate. So that little bit there in ammonium form, it maintained a greater quantity of nitrogen in the ammonium form when DCD did, when nitrogen was applied as ammonium sulfate in 1982, when it was applied with 2-pound apps. Okay, that was in May of 1982. In November of 1982, the inclusion of DCD to urea and to ammonium sulfate did nothing in terms of its changing the differences or changing the amount of ammonium compared to nitrate. There was no, didn't have an effect on the quantity of ammonium or the quantity of nitrate. In 1983, in April of 1983, again, nothing, no differences in ammonium and nitrate. In April of 1984, no differences between ammonium nitrate. And then in December of 1984, remember they split it. So they're just looking at the top 3 or 4 inches compared to each other there, and then they looked at the bottom 12 inches, and they did see more differences there, where the DCD resulted in greater quantities of ammonium when it was applied as ammonium sulfate in the top 4 inches, but that's what happened by that. But with urea, it didn't show any benefit with the inclusion of DCD to urea. In other words, the inclusion of DCD to urea did not result in greater quantities of ammonium compared to just applying urea alone, which is what the compound's supposed to do. It was effective when it was applied as ammonium sulfate, but not when applied as with urea. All right. And then when you looked at nitrate, the urea and ammonium sulfate both resulted in greater quantities of nitrate. In other words, the DCD resulted in less nitrate from urea and from ammonium sulfate. So there was a little bit there in terms of what we would expect to see from the inclusion of DCD when it comes to the nitrate. The population of nitrate in the soil should be greater using the DCD, should be less when using DCD than when not using DCD. Okay. So there's a little bit there at the end of the year 1984 when you looked at the very top of the soil. Remember, none of these resulted in greater quality of turfgrass, and none of them resulted in greater increased growth of turfgrass. Okay, but there is a little bit going on in the soil at the end of the year in 1984. The majority of time, you see nothing happening. 1982, 1983, the beginning of 1984, the end of 1982, nothing happened. There was no influence in ammonium and nitrate when you included DCD. That was 2-pound apps. When you look at 2 1-pound apps, it gets worse for DCD, unfortunately. 1982, when you applied 4 1-pound applications, there was no differences in ammonium when you included DCD. There was no differences in nitrate when you included DCD. So when you used urea or ammonium sulfate, they were the same, whether you included DCD or not. In 1982, in the November of 1982, ammonium sulfate resulted in less ammonium. Let me say it backwards. Ammonium sulfate with DCD resulted in greater quantities of ammonium than without DCD. So there was a little bit there. And you're looking at this right here, 5 parts per million versus 14 parts per million. So you almost tripled the amount of ammonium in the nitrogen in the form of ammonium when DCD was included. And that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to maintain greater quantities in the ammonium form. And it did that in 1982, November of 1982, but only when it was in the form of ammonium sulfate, not when it was included as urea. And again, this didn't result in a benefit to the turf. Nothing changed in benefit of the turf, but in the soil, there was more quantities of ammonium. However, in 1980, and then nothing happened in 1983, no differences in ammonium and nitrate. In 1984, the opposite happened, where ammonium sulfate resulted in greater quantities of ammonium than ammonium sulfate with DCD. So you can wash these out, basically. Okay. This is what we're talking about right here. It was one time DCD resulted in more, one time no DCD resulted in more. And then in 1984, the same thing happened again. Ammonium sulfate resulted in more ammonium than ammonium sulfate with DCD in the top 4 inches. Okay. And nothing happened with urea except with the nitrate. The DCD did result in greater quantities of nitrate, which it should result in less quantities of nitrate than urea. This what we're talking about here is 4.8 versus 6.8. The inclusion of DCD should result in less nitrate, but it resulted in more nitrate in one rating day or one sample collection at the end of 1984. So basically the take home of the soil nitrate and ammonium is basically a wash. Sometimes it resulted in more ammonium, sometimes it resulted in less ammonium, sometimes it resulted in more nitrate, sometimes it resulted in greater nitrate, and most of the time nothing happened. Okay. We're going to come down to the end here. Let me see if I can. Okay, the very end of this is the end of the paper. Although DCD inhibited nitrification for a short period when 2 pounds of nitrogen was applied twice, except for slightly higher visual quality. Remember, nothing happened statistically. They're just saying it tended to be higher. Except for slightly higher visual quality, it did not improve turf response to soluble nitrogen applications over 3 years at either fertilization regime. And just remember, except for slightly higher visual quality, there was no higher visual quality. Okay? So what they're saying is the application of DCD to urea or ammonium sulfate when it was applied 2 times at 2 pounds didn't improve turf response over 3 years. Okay? However, and then it keeps going under, okay. Oh, he tries to explain what's going on. Let me just read this because there's not much left. A possible explanation is that leaching of nitrate was not a significant problem, and periods conducive to denitrification occurred long after DCD application when nitrate concentrations were similar between DCD-emitted fertilizers, urea, and ammonium sulfate. Under conditions favorable to leaching of nitrate, high seasonal rainfall and coarse textured soils, DCD may prevent nitrate losses for 2 to 3 weeks at a rate of, I guess that's a quarter pound of nitrogen. I don't know where they got that from, but however, this short period of effectiveness would not warrant its use as an inhibitor in turf nitrogen programs at application rates less than a quarter pound. I don't know where they're getting this just less than a quarter pound. I guess maybe it's just DCD. That's what they're probably saying. Just the DCD less than a quarter pound. I don't know where they're getting that from, but it's a little bit vague how they worded that. Increased ammonium uptake may account for the slightly higher turf quality. Remember, there was no higher turf quality. I don't know why they're saying that. But the limited effect of DCD on nitrification does not support this premise. So there you go. The slow release of nitrogen from the breakdown of DCD was not evident. The nitrification patterns implied rapid breakdown of DCD, but the amount of nitrogen derived from DCD was probably not large enough to measure a response. Yeah, so that 19 point, so the quarter of a pound was the nitrogen in the DCD form, I guess is what they're saying there. Okay. So the short and skinny of it is nothing happened, and it didn't warrant a response. Did not improve turf response to soluble nitrogen over 3 years. Okay. And it says the short period of effectiveness of DCD, which essentially it sounds like it was effective for right after application maybe, but it would not warrant its use as an inhibitor in turf nitrogen programs. That's what it said. So the summation of this whole study is when you included a more expensive compound into urea or ammonium sulfate, that being DCD in this case, the compound that's the additive that's intended to reduce nitrification, which in turn reduces denitrification and leaching. That's the intent. It didn't really have much of effect on the species of nitrogen in the soil. Sometimes it was more ammonium, sometimes it was more nitrate. Most of the time, nothing happened. It didn't have much of any effect on turf quality, no statistical effect on turf quality. I would argue no biological effect on turf quality. And it had no statistical effect on turfgrass yield, really, except for 1 or 2 points. But the majority of time, nothing happened. Okay. And again, this is a much more expensive product than just urea or just ammonium sulfate. So you're adding a lot of expense and you're not getting hardly anything in return. And in most cases, you wouldn't get any return. In some cases, you would actually get a negative return. Okay. So this paper certainly does not provide any evidence to warrant the inclusion of a DCD or DCD type product, or nitrification inhibitor type product in turf grasses. There's nothing here for that. And I'm going to show a paper in the future that does have a little bit of evidence for that. But certainly the paper yesterday didn't support it at all. The paper today does not support it at all. Okay, guys? I'll read through the chat real quick, see if there's anything interesting you want me to address before I go. Oh, good morning, UF Gator. Oh, you're in Maryland. Hey, good to know. Good to know. To till turf. Good morning, all from Nova Scotia. Okay, that's again. I'm sorry if you've texted me. I see so many new handles. It's good to see. Mitch Bird says, we're lucky and thankful for all your help. I have picked up more useful information in a few months than I have from 25 years of salesman pitching products. Okay, well, thank you for that. Very, very kind. And Elevated Landscapes says, you're late, but you made it. yesterday's show further supported your position on liquid versus granular N applications. Okay, well, that's good to hear. I mean, there's definitely value to both sorts of programs. You can produce perfectly acceptable turf with liquid programs or with granular programs. There's risks associated with both and there's costs associated with both. But, I'm glad you found some use out of it. I'm going to leave you with a little music today. Tomorrow I'll be on in the morning at 10 a.m. I will not be on tomorrow night. And look for me probably Thursday or Friday, probably in the a.m., potentially in the a.m. this week. I'll see what I can do about getting another show on before the end of this week. Okay, guys, really appreciate everybody showing up today. Thanks so much. I'll see you tomorrow morning. Be kind. Bye.